Lessons from Mongolia's transition to democracy. The glasnost and perestroika reforms launched by Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet Union led not only to the downfall of communist governments in Europe, Mongolia, a Soviet satellite in Asia, and from 1924, the first communist state outside the Soviet Union, underwent an exemplary peaceful transition. During the communist period, Mongolia was a rigid, one-party state with a centrally planned economy and Marxist ideology imposed through the total control of education and news media. During the 1930s, the country suffered fierce repression that coincided with Stalin's purges in the Soviet Union. Under Soviet pressure, many Mongolian nobles, intellectuals, military officers, and Buddhist monks were shot. Hundreds of monasteries were destroyed. Khorlugin Choibalsan, who was the Prime Minister of the Mongolian People Republic from 1930 until 1952, became known as Mongolia's Stalin. While reports on the actual number vary, the purges may have killed as many as 100,000 people. At first sight, Mongolia in 1989-1990 might have seemed the least likely communist state ever to make such a transition. It had no tradition of parliamentary democracy and was one of the poorest socialist countries in the world, with a per capita income of less than $1,200 a year. In the mid-1980s, the government initiated some economic reforms along the lines of Gorbachev's perestroika and Soviet Union, but several young people who became the leaders of the democracy movement wanted more. Among them was the current president, my friend Jakyagin Elbegdorji, who had studied in Moscow and was impressed by the glasnost aspect of reform and allowed greater freedom of expression. With the example of the dramatic changes in Eastern Europe before them, Elbegdorji and his colleagues announced the formation of the Mongolian Democratic Union, MDU, at the first demonstration in the country against the one-party rule. They demanded a multi-party system of representation and implementation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the government and the party. They were committed to peaceful protest because they understood that this was the only way to successfully challenge a government that held a monopoly of force. Demonstrations in the capital, Ulaanbaatar, grew from a few thousand in January 1990 to 40,000 in April. When rumors spread that the government might use force on the demonstrators, greater numbers of Mongolians turned out to support them. In the face of growing public pressure, the entire Politburo resigned and dissolved itself. The MDU entered into negotiations with the governing Mongolian People's Revolutionary Party, the MPRP, and ultimately agreed on the end of the one-party system. On July 29, 1990, Mongolia held its first free multi-party election and the MPRP won. Nevertheless, they observed democratic principles, saw a new constitution passed in 1992, and moved into opposition peacefully when they were defeated in the 1996 general election. Since the end of communism, Mongolia has experienced several general and 6 presidential elections, each time with a peaceful transition in power. There have been coalition governments between the MPRP and other parties. Mongolia is a striking example of the successful transition from a poor country under totalitarian communist rule to a functioning democracy committed to human rights and freedoms. It now has a growing market economy and has opened up to the potential to tap the great wealth of natural resources it possesses. Its path was not easy. Mongolia suffered extreme economic hardship after Soviet subsidies ended, even having to provide food rations at one point in the early 1990s. Yet Mongolians preserved throughout this difficult period, with their commitment to a society built upon human rights and freedoms for which they had overturned communist rule. President Elbegdorji stressed the principles upon which Mongolia stood when he spoke in Pyongyang at Kim Il-sung University in 2013, a visit I described in Chapter 3. Calling the desire for freedom and eternal power, he declared Mongolia is a country respecting human rights and freedoms, upholding rule of law and pursuing open policies. Mongolia holds dear the fundamental human rights, freedom of expression, right to assembly, and the right to live by his or her own choice. Mongolia offers many lessons for North Korea. Mongolia's rise from a poor totalitarian regime with no history of popular government to what it represents today shows what could be possible to the north. Mongolia, in a short 25 years, went from being a defunct communist state to a vibrant young democracy with a booming economy at the heart of the Asian continent. This transition unleashed the potential and enterprise of the Mongolian people and helped lead the economy out of its doldrums and on a path to prosperity. Despite being surrounded by 2 vast nuclear-armed authoritarian powers in Russia and China, Mongolia to this day does not seek to reinforce its own security through nuclear weapons. President Elbegdorj underlined these lessons also in his visit to Pyongyang. With the regime increasingly unstable and the future uncertain, the North Korean elite and the party cadre face some serious challenges. Mongolia's example offers them the prospect of a peaceful move out of totalitarianism, as the Mongolian Communist Party and most of the communist parties of Eastern Europe did in their respective countries to ensure their survival during the inevitable transition to democracy and a free market system. The only regime that did not survive was that of Romania. As mentioned above, this lesson should not be lost on Pyongyang's leadership. The parallels between Eastern Europe in 1989 and North Korea today are striking. Change came in Eastern Europe because the Soviet Union could and would no longer militarily back their satellite regimes. After the USSR dissolved, China became the North's main backer. Today, however, China is making it clear that its support for the North Korean regime is not unconditional. Beijing would like to see a leadership that aligns more closely with China's interest of economic development and regional stability. Finally, North Korean leaders must realize that the hold the regime has on its people is weakening daily. Harkening back to the good old days under Kim Il-sung and promoting a so-called Neo-Juche ideology will not change that reality. As described in Chapter 3, breakdown in the food distribution system and the impact of changes in access to information make preservation of the status quo untenable. North Korean citizens and the rest of the world know much more now about the reality of North Korea. As a result of these developments and his own actions, Kim Jong-un does not command the respect of his grandfather or even his father did. Kim Jong-un does not command the respect that his grandfather or even his father did. He is no longer the trusted leader North Koreans were indoctrinated to look toward, but is seen as an inexperienced and morally corrupt. For the North's leadership as well as the bureaucrats who run the country, this is a moment of truth. Change is inevitable and almost certainly will come sooner rather than later. Lessons of recent history lie before them, and the North Korean reality is becoming ever clearer as it emerges from the fog of past propaganda. The North's regime eventually will have to decide what to do when the metaphoric North Korean ship starts to sink. Will they drown with the sinking ship, remaining hardliners to the end, or will they reconcile to ensure their survival in the next chapters of Korea's story as a unified nation poised to lead the world?